Well, the doors are closed, so they're locking us in for the next hour. Marketing sucks is the presentation, and I think after this presentation, you'll probably agree that marketing, or at least me, really does suck quite badly. This has been a bit of a cobbled-together presentation, because I changed things up at the very last minute, because I realized I was guilty of one of the mistakes that I'm going to accuse marketers of, but we'll get to that in a quick second. My name's Darren Williams. I work at Unity. I'm the marketing director at the San Francisco office. Prior to that, I was in games. I've been doing it for 13 years. I was at Microprose, Hasbro, THQ, and Sega. With me and joining me on stage in about halfway through the presentation, we've got Dan Adams. Dan, would you please stand? He's the PR guy who works with me in San Francisco, was in PR for 11 years, was the editor-in-chief at IGN PC, so a true PR guru. And then we have Tracy Erickson. He was in PR for about 6 years. As you can see, Pocket Gamer, GamePro, Games Radar, Games TM. We're not sure what he did at Playboy. We think he kept his clothes on, but he knows a lot about PR anyway. So, why does marketing suck? I thought about how I was going to structure this presentation for you guys. And initially, I was going to cram this full of do this, do that, the top 10 things to do within marketing. And I realized that was probably a little bit futile, because one of the mistakes I see within marketing is an obsession with tactics. Marketing doesn't always get it right. So if marketing doesn't get it right, then obviously developers are going to get confused and wonder what it is that you should be doing. When I talk about a civil war in marketing, it's not quite as dramatic as that. But there's been a huge amount of disruption within marketing, as we know, brought about through app stores, iOS, Android, the rise of digital marketing, and it falls into two camps effectively. You've got the traditional marketers, guys who are spending money on TV, print, outdoor, the classic marketing approaches that have been used for decades. Then you have the digital guys. The digital guys obviously have access to a lot more direct marketing channels, amazing analytics. So they really shouldn't be fighting with each other, but where there's money involved, you have the digital guys saying the traditional guys are out of date, TV is dead, digital is the future, and you get into this sort of hubbub of antagonism between the marketing community. There's also an element, and it's going away, I think, but I remember about 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm sure that Dan and Tracy will talk about this, there was this whole PR is dead, it doesn't matter anymore, social media is the future. It's a bit of an unnecessary mindset to have, because they're effectively becoming the same thing. The key difference is the directness in terms of how you get the message to the consumer. So mistake number one, this is what I think marketing is guilty of, and this is why I think marketing can be a confusing topic. It's obsessing about the tactics, the things that you do. And a lot of the communication you see on a lot of sites, really, really good sites, say like Pocket Gamer, Gamer Sutra, you get a lot of case studies, and they tend to be of the nature of we did this, we did this, we did this, and then we won. These are the tactical things that these guys do. They talk about how much they spend, which ad networks they use, which incent program they use, what CPI, CPA goal they were chasing for. Now, these are really, really powerful tools, but they're tactics. They're the thing that you do at the end of your planning and your strategizing. And it leads to a little bit of a blinded mindset that what you need to do is focus on this individual piece of activity, that there's a silver bullet, that if all you did was this, then all of your marketing problems would be solved. The problem, of course, for you guys, especially being a little bit more in the indie community, is that this stuff takes money. One of the ironies that I see here is that whereas digital marketers have spoken about the death of TV and mass media, it is a mass media channel now when you're going to be putting out ads to millions of mobile devices. It's mass media, it's just of a different type. And mass media inevitably becomes quite an expensive thing. And there's not a lot of companies, let alone small indie studios, that can engage in this kind of mass media buying awareness, buying installs kind of activity. We shouldn't criticize them for doing this. I heard through various conversations that Supercell, that I think we all admire in terms of how they've grown, they're going to be spending about $300 million in the next 12 months acquiring consumers. I'd say, well done, guys. You've grown a great business, but $300 million isn't something that we can do and we can go and spend. So what does an indie guy do? As part of this sort of civil war topic that I mentioned at the beginning, there's a little bit of an abandonment of what might be called classic marketing theory, and I'm sure you've seen this graph many, many times. This is how a product comes to market. It gets introduced to a small audience, it grows, the product and therefore the market matures, and things start to decline. There's two classic marketing approaches that have been used for years. The attempt is always to try and get to the maturity phase as quickly as you can. What's tended to be done there with consumer goods especially is they just spend, reach as many people as possible, drive awareness with the mass market. If the mass market know about it, then it's a percentage game. You have attach rates, then you start seeing huge volumes of sales. But it's difficult to get there if you haven't got cash. The second part of the classic theory of marketing is that where you see the decline curve, what people try to do is extend the product life cycle. They're trying to stop the product declining. So it could be new products, line extensions, pricing, things of that nature. That's a very, very classical marketing theory. Tied to this as well, you have the audience. So if you think of the phases of how a product comes into the market, you have to have different audience types. And this is where it will start becoming a little more relevant about what you guys can be doing to improve or at least adopt some wiser marketing strategies. You have the innovators. They're the guys who have the word of mouth power. Small audience, very opinionated, incredibly technically aware, particularly for the nature of our business. They're small, but they have massive influence. Then, if the product gets adopted by these guys, it'll go to the early adopters, still technically aware, but in effect, they've looked at what the innovators have done. It's kind of got a soft approval from these innovators. They're willing to adopt the product. Then you get to the mass market and so on and so forth. Now, if we take this graph, this concept of there being a product life cycle and different audiences, it's interesting. I came to the realization this morning, this is exactly what Unity itself went through. The product, say 6, 7 years ago, was very, very small in terms of adoption. Then it went to free. So it had a core community of very intelligent, very passionate developers, and it's grown and grown and grown. So we've got an example within Unity itself, and David spoke in his keynote about the acceleration of the adoption of not just Unity, but also mobile phones, for example. Unity went through this curve. Small audience, took some time to grow, but then it got on the curve and it's exploded. Now, what's interesting here, and I hinted at it just a few seconds ago, is that in almost direct proportion to the market size, influence comes into play. The innovators, the early adopters, the guys who really know their stuff, they're the difficult ones to reach, but once you reach them, their influence, their word of mouth, their ability to validate the product is much, much higher. So what started to happen, some of the smarter studios have realized that rather than trying to get right to the mass market through spend and muscle and brute force, it's actually far better to try and court this innovator group. This is the community building phase that I'm sure some of you guys are aware of. Because if you win these guys over, they validate further up the product life cycle. So if the innovator gives you a big thumbs up, the early adopter will start, okay, my friend's been telling me about this game, about this product, so you're willing to take a chance with it. Then early adopters, as a bigger market, that will start penetrating into mass market awareness. So this will relate not to spend, not to advertising, but what you do with community building, PR, social media. Mistake number 2 I see a lot within games is that a lot of the companies aren't taking enough time to build a pre-release community. And what I mean by pre-release community, it's getting those innovators excited, engaged by your product. Some of you might be aware of the phrase otaku. It's a Japanese term, and it was sort of born of obsessive, for the want of a better term, nerds who would just obsess about any specific piece of media, be it anime, be it toys. And it was kind of almost a critical term in Japan for a long, long time, but it got co-opted. So people define themselves as otaku as this sort of badge of honor. So in the same way that indie devs, you could say, are an otaku because they don't care about the fact that big monolithic companies look at indies and think, oh, it's a little bit ragged, it's a little bit different. There's a lot of pride in being an indie dev. There's a lot of pride in playing indie games. So what you're trying to do with a pre-release community from a gaming perspective is identify who the otaku are. So it could be it's a player of an existing game. If you're making an RTS, you might decide that you want to go after, I don't know, a Total War fan, for example. If you can win some of these guys over, their viral spread of opinion will get you further up the chain. The phases of reaching these guys and just getting to the mass market then, what it means from a practical perspective is the otaku, the innovators, who are really, really intelligent, really, really opinionated, really, really stubborn. How do you convince those guys? And Dan will reach to this a little bit later as we start talking about press and PR. But at the beginning of the campaigns, when you start engaging, these are the guys that want to know really detailed information about your game. This is where you can start talking about referencing other games, specific features, and it's so broad because it's going to depend on the type of game that you're making, what kind of information you give these guys. But these are the kind of guys who literally cannot get enough. They want tons of assets, tons of screenshots, tons of information. They like the sense that they're speaking directly to you, that they've got a direct communication channel. The further you go along the life cycle, the broader the message gets. So you're very technical, detailed at the beginning, then you start broadening out and becoming a little less technical. Because if you go to a mass market gamer, and mass market doesn't mean dumb or casual, just the biggest chunk of your potential audience, if you hit them with a bunch of technical detail, they're liable to be confused because they haven't had the sense that the pre-existing community has validated the game. They haven't had that word of mouth follow them. So there are some examples. Pocket Gamer, I don't know if you know pocketgamer.biz, it's absolutely rife with fantastic case studies of how games have succeeded. They've tended to be a bit focused on narrow examples, or at least narrow tactics, so to my point earlier about obsessing about tactics. But I find this a really interesting quote. So Frogmind, who made Badlands, they were at GDC Europe, and they were talking about how they stirred the community, they built the pre-release community by having a great demo, which was a very reflective, not a vertical slice, but it showed the game in a short, condensed manner. So people got it, they followed it up with a trailer. Very, very small piece of activity, and ultimately fairly commonplace. If any of you have worked in console or PC gaming for years, you'll realize that this is a fairly common approach to put out a demo, put out a trailer. But it's not so much what they did, it's the principle involved, that they realized they had to win a community over. And when I talk about community, it's not just fans, it's also press. Monster Blade, again, a pocketgamer.biz article, they spoke about how they got 1 million downloads without spending a penny. Now, their specific approach, their specific tactic, was to build a Facebook page, stack it with content, and get people engaged and use Facebook as something of a springboard to get people to download. So the tactic itself isn't necessarily the important thing here. It's the principle. Build a community pre-release. Don't think that that community has to be massive. If you've got a target of 1 million downloads, don't think that your pre-release community has to be 1 million. It just needs to be a small, hardcore, deeply informed, very impassionate user base who will then spread the word of mouth, the whole viral effect that I think a lot of you have heard about. Mistake 3 is not planning in a linear fashion. So campaigns are linear. A lot of people think that you just need to go away, code, to develop, launch the game, and then start the marketing. So if we adopt this community planning model and the idea that you've got to reach the community before, you realize that there are steps to this. So a campaign can be broken down into 3 phases. Phase 1 is community building. Some people call it pre-release. What it's called really isn't that important. It's the principle involved, that you're not waiting until the release date before you start your marketing. So some guys are great at doing this. Some guys haven't got the resources to do this. But the principle is that if you can, generate assets early, generate a trailer if you can, generate interviews, try and get the press involved. So by the time you get to launch, you're not starting from zero in terms of awareness, and you hopefully then have attracted an audience who have kind of given the thumbs up and have validated the game. You don't advertise pre-launch unless you've got more money than sense or just want to try it. When you get to phase 2 at launch, if you have money, that's where you start spending, but don't spend without building the community first. Money alone will not get you too far unless you're spending hundreds of millions and have got the brute force approach. I won't talk too much about retention because this starts becoming a little bit more of a development issue. But the mistakes of the console days, where it would be just fire and forget, launch a game, leave it there, I think we all realize, especially in digital, mobile, and social, that if you can retain players in the game, they're more likely to monetize, approve, download additional content. And retention's a massive topic. It could be additional packs, it could be price fluctuations, burst advertising campaigns. We don't need to touch that just yet. The point here is that you should build yourself a plan. Don't wait until launch until you start thinking about marketing. Mistake 4, this is where we start becoming a little more blue sky, but I think this is a really, really interesting one because a lot of what we've spoken about haven't really gone into user acquisition and advertising, but it all comes down to money. Branding doesn't have to be the sole purview of big companies. You guys can brand, and you probably have the advantage you can be a hell of a lot more agile than a big company. But there's a lot of mistakes spoken about branding, particularly within the marketing world itself. So logos are not branding. When you see a logo and you say that's great branding, you're kind of saying it's a nice image, but it's not the brand. The logo is not the brand. The logo is the manifestation of the brand. And if you think about brands in the correct way, the brand is based on positioning. The logo is the manifestation of your brand. There's a channel, and I'll get to positioning in just a second. But branding is not, I decide that I want this to be blue. It needs to be red. Our brand is orange. These are rather simplistic questions because there's a whole bunch of consideration and thought that goes in ahead of that. Positioning is not a slogan. Positioning was invented in 1969, if such a thing could be invented. There are two quite well-known, reasonably famous in marketing circles authors, Jack Trout and Al Ries. They wrote a bunch of articles for Advertising Age. It sort of ran for about 10 consecutive weeks. Massive response, very popular. And they thought, right, we're going to compile this and make a book. Now, bearing in mind this was 1969, their perception was the market's saturated. There's too much communication, too much advertising. People are bombarded with 2,000 selling messages a day. So how on earth does a product stand out in a quote-unquote saturated market? And that's 1969, when all you had was TV, some cinema, radio, and a bit of outdoor. If you look at the channels we've got now, with 700,000 apps on the store, what chance has a consumer got? So as I mentioned at the beginning, the idea that some of the newer digital marketers kind of abandon traditional policies, that's a mistake, because this kind of classical brand positioning thinking can really give you guys some huge advantage, because if you have limited assets, you want to make each one apparent, really, really quite evident what your game is. Don't mistake simplicity for being dumb. Also, don't think that creativity means complex. We don't have to get in that too much. But the best branding, the best positioning is actually very, very simple. The point about positioning, it's the impression you want to leave in someone's mind. It's often quite an emotional thing, so it can be very, very broad. But what you do when you're positioning the products, you don't think, I want somebody to think that my game is better. Because if you're saying that your game is better than somebody else's, effectively you're telling, so let's assume you're making a racing game, and you're saying, I'm better than CSR Racing. All those fans of CSR Racing, when they hear that, you're telling them that they're stupid for liking that game. My game's better. I'm better than you. My game's better than that, therefore you're stupid. And when you have that kind of conversation, that's the psychological process people go through. How on earth are you going to convert that people? They could be quite happy playing CSR Racing. They don't want to hear that they're dumb for doing something that they enjoy. So be careful with branding and positioning not to fall into the trap of, I'm better than you, because then you start getting into a quite conflicted argument. And as a few people in marketing say, the hardest thing to change is a mind. So you shouldn't try. You should try repositioning. Now, as I assume we're at the party last night, we should talk about beer. I actually am a fan of looking at examples from other industries because we're all within gaming, and so we all have opinions and preconceptions. So I think we need a little bit of space to consider other examples to help the concept really hit home. So Becks beer, I think this was sort of mid-70s. They were huge in Germany, probably the biggest selling beer in Germany, but were nowhere in the US. Lowenbrau was the biggest selling German beer in the US. But as is the way with a lot of beer, it's made under license, so this German beer was actually being brewed in Pittsburgh. So it didn't have an authentic edge, but it was the #1 selling German beer in the US. Now, Beck's positioning, what they wanted to do was to convince the market that Lowenbrau isn't the best German beer. Beck's is the best German beer. But as we spoke about, if you go in and say we're better, or that this product or this beer is crap, you should read like this one. Effectively, you're selling fans of Lowenbrau. You make a mistake buying this drink. You should listen to me because I know better. So the positioning, the idea behind the idea, was that Beck's is the authentic German beer. So their solution was to run a print ad. Couldn't find it. Internet here's crap. Sorry about that. We'll spend more money next year. The ad was a picture of Lowenbrau. They said, you've drank the most popular German beer in the US. That was the opening headline of their ad. So, now drink the most popular German beer in Germany. It was what we call repositioning. At a stroke, Lowenbrau suddenly thought, oh, crap, this is bloody awful. And people made the leap in their own mind because the authenticity of the beer was completely undermined. Becks can then come in and take that position without saying, this is terrible, we're better. So it's about adjusting the perception. Remember, positioning is about wanting to leave an impression in someone's mind. Beck's idea was that they wanted to supplant Lowenbrau. They wanted to claim this position of being the best beer, but they wanted to do it in such a way that they didn't antagonize the existing audience. Now, this is beer. This is 1975. What kind of relevance does that have today, and particularly to you guys? If you remember the Samsung, I know that we're all not living in North America, so I'll apologize if you don't know the ad, but I'm sure you've seen the Samsung TV ad where you've got the cool hipster dude waiting in line for the Apple store, well, the quote-unquote Apple store, playing with his S4. All of the Apple fanboys look at it, and the punchline is that he was holding a place in line for his middle-aged mum and dad. Ergo, Samsung is the phone that the cool kids use. The iPhone is the thing that your mum and dad and your gran use. It's a repositioning effort. That isn't necessarily something that can always be done in games. It can be done, but that gives you an idea about positioning and what the point of it is. It's about leaving an impression. It doesn't have to be negative, but you want to leave an impression. So we'll talk about Monster Blade again. And I really, really like this quote, because often when I'm speaking with developers, and I used to do it a lot in my prior time at Sega and THQ, the first question I would always ask a developer is, why the hell should anyone play this game? It sounds provocative and it sounds antagonistic, but it's not meant to be. Because what you should be thinking of is fundamentally, why should anyone care about my game? This will force you to be incredibly honest. It'll stop you falling into the trap of thinking that marketing is a 15 bullet point list of features. That, well, you should play my game because we do this, and we do this, and we do this, and we do this, and we do that. It becomes boring, and for the audience you're trying to win at the beginning, that innovator, the otaku, they're going to look at that and say, well, you say you're better than Game X, but what about this feature? And they start picking this thing apart. So you're trying to leave a positive impression there. So where Monster Blade succeeded is not only in terms of having that Facebook community with 100,000 likes driving the million downloads, they were very honest with themselves about what the game is, what the game wasn't. So they tailored their message. So what you should really try to do is get the pitch, the elevator pitch, the positioning of your game as tight and as narrow as possible. And this is, I think, one of the things that scares a lot of marketing folk. Because if you go in and pitch a game on the basis of one idea, one concept, there's a lot of nervous because you feel as though you're walking a tightrope. So you've got some marketing folk who just lose their bottle, they lose their nerve, and they talk about this one thing, and then they lapse into, oh, and it's got this feature, and this feature, and this feature, and this feature, and this feature. The theory in those guys' mind is if I just talk a lot, and if I say how broad this game is, I'm kind of safe, because if I say 10 things, 3 might stick, oh, that's great. The other route is a little bit braver, but it's actually the better way to do it, particularly if you don't have a huge amount of money, because what you're trying to do is get that small core audience tied in as opposed to reaching everyone from day one. So, these are broad concepts. I've not dove into specifics, and I tried to avoid the whole do this, do that, this specific thing, the 10 things you should do. But there are 2 things you should do. And Emil will remember this, because I told him to buy this book. By Positioning the Battle for Your Mind, Jack Trout, Al Reese. It's a classic marketing text. Very, very approachable. Some of the examples, I have to say, have gotten a little bit dated, because it's a book that's been in reprint and been updated since about 1972. But get beyond that. The principles, especially the first half of the book, are fantastic. They will open your mind up to what positioning really is and how you guys can then take advantage of that. Then, either at the same time or maybe prior to that, there's a fantastic Seth Godin talk on the TED website. It's how to get your ideas to spread. He takes a lot of the ideas that Trout and Reese talk about, and he references sliced bread and painkillers, but the principle is the same. That if there's a market that's saturated with painkillers, which is one particular example, you walk into a drugstore and you see 25 different painkillers, are you going to even bother to figure out why? You just grab the nearest one. So when we contemplate the fact that the iOS store's got 700,000 apps, 800,000 apps, positioning, some clever thought in the idea that you don't have to reach anyone from day one, these can help you stand out in amongst this huge number of apps that are there. So if we think again back to the logic of building the community and just going on this gradual slope, if you get your positioning right, you have a unique and differentiated concept that people can understand and feel emotional about, and that grows and that grows and that grows, and you can then suddenly look at your Facebook page with 100,000 likes, such as Monster Hunter. By the time you go knocking on Apple's door and want to get featured, you say, well, look, 100,000 fans here. We've got this amount of viral traffic out there. That will strengthen you in terms of actually when you get to the actual tactical part of the mix. We'll do a Q&A after Tracy and Dan have spoken about PR. I've spoken very broadly, very conceptually. I think the takeaway is that I'm more interested in helping you guys get the right basic concepts in place, because obsessing over tactics can drive you insane. It can also be a very expensive endeavor. So check these books out. They're really, really strong. They will give you a really good idea about how you can start getting creative and how it is that even a small team with virtually no money can start making an impression and drive some downloads. So, I've spoken enough. We'll now have the PR gurus come up on stage and give you a little bit more detailed information on how your asset should be shaped and what your messaging should sound like.
Hello. Hey, everybody. So we'll just run through this quick. So why does public relations matter? You get a lot of ideas about what exactly PR is, and it's not a totally same thing as marketing, because you get this for free. And when I say free, I actually mean all of the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into it. So there's actually a lot of cost in terms of your time, but everything you do in it, well, not everything, but a lot of things you do in it are actually free of cost, aside from traveling around and seeing journalists and such like that. But as Darren already hit on, a lot of this stuff is about building a brand and building that message at the core. So you want to craft this message and, excuse me, and tie it in with everything that you talked about, social media, these press, make sure to hit them, and build this brand and build this awareness for your game very early on so that it can grow. Anytime you want to jump in.
So I was thinking a lot about, particularly when this concept of reaching out and creating a message, and I think it's important to make a distinction between messaging and communication. Because a lot of developers I see when they get ready, and okay, we know we need to reach out to the press, we know we need to communicate with communities and start that process before we launch our game. But if you reach out and you start talking about your game without actually having sat down and thought about what your message is, what it is that you actually want to say and put out there for your community to actually latch on and get excited about. If you're just communicating, just like, as Darren said, different features and how the game is playing, rather than actually saying, this game, this adventure experience is about wonder and about interactivity. And then from that, you're able to build out communications and touch points from which you can reach out to media and say, this is a great adventure game because it's about something magical and it's about interactivity, and look at all the great levels we have and the amazing graphics that we have. And there's a point by which there's detail there in which they can report. You can write an article about how great the graphics look, but the overall arching sort of appeal, the message, is about how wonderfully interactive this adventure game is, rather than just a bullet point list of features.
So planning, and a lot of what Tracy just said has to do with planning. You do have to find that focus for your game, so you're not just overwhelming people with a ridiculous amount of information about little points of interest. It's about finding what makes your game special. So your communication plans, they really need to be developed from the beginning. You need to put together a PR plan, put down points like 3 to 5 points of things that make your game interesting. And you can make comparisons to other games, but mostly you want to find the things that are really going to make, that you feel are what make your game special in what is now a very, very crowded market. Because there are a lot of games out there, and you're competing with a lot more people than you ever were before. So finding that message is very important. And then getting out there and communicating it with the right people. When you are planning your communications, you have to be very aware of what platforms you're going out for. How you design communication plan for a very large PC or AAA game or like a console game is a very different ball of wax than developing a communication plan for an iOS game. Because generally, those consoles and AAA PC games, that's a really long marketing cycle and PR cycle. You can do that for a year or even over a year. Whereas an iOS game or an Android game, you've got maybe a month. The attention span of a gamer, and especially the press, the gaming press for these mobile games, is tiny because they have so many things coming at them. So you really have to have those messages intact and planned so that you can communicate effectively with these guys and drive the point home as quickly as possible and embed it for that month or 2 months when you've got that window of opportunity. And one of the biggest ways, of course, to communicate is with assets. Now it's a very visual world, these guys that write all of these things about games, all the words. Not as many people really read them anymore. So you want to have these assets, especially trailers. Screenshots used to be a lot more important, especially in print, when print was a big thing. But now it's all about trailers and seeing the games in motion. So you really want to make amazing assets that are going to catch people's attention. But like developing these assets is actually a bit of a challenge. And as it says here, when you are creating screenshots, and screenshots are always included with any story you see up, you want to make sure that it tells a story and that you're actually showing something off from that plan that you've created of these are the 3 things that make my game special. You want to make sure in these screenshots that you're actually telling a story about this. So if you're missing the point with your screenshot and it doesn't coincide with the messaging that you've created and the idea of your game that you've created, then it's not a successful screenshot. The same thing goes for trailers. Like if you're not actually showing the things that you think make your game special, that's not a successful trailer, and people aren't really going to get the point of what you're trying to get across. Another thing to say about, sorry, here, do you want to go?
Yeah, no, I just want to extend that. I think the screenshot, what you're talking about in terms of really sort of zeroing in on making sure that your screenshots tell a story and are very effective. This doesn't just apply to pre-release, marketing activities. This also applies to your App Store description. And I mention this because I see a lot of descriptions that have screenshots that tell you nothing about the game. It's a main menu screenshot, or it's layered with so many marketing phrases that you don't actually get a sense of what the game is like. As a consumer, that's what you're interested in, right? I mean, you're wanting to buy a game, you want to know, okay, it's a word game. What kind of game am I actually, how am I making these words? How am I actually moving these tiles around? And if all you have is some character saying, buy me on the screen, I'm a fun word game, you're probably not going to download it unless there's, you know the brand or the developer. And so really kind of taking the time, taking a couple of hours to say, okay, we're just going to take a ton of screenshots and then weeding through and saying, yeah, those are the ones that really are going to be the most effective at telling and communicating what our game is. And using those not only in your pre-release materials, but also in your App Store description can make a huge difference.
And one more point I want to make about trailers. Don't make them too long, please. I see a lot of trailers these days that are like 4 or 5 minutes long. Don't do that. Just don't, please. They need to be very concise, and they need to be able to catch somebody, bring them in, and get the point across in about 30 seconds of footage. If you need to, you can maybe stretch it to a minute, but that's really pushing it, frankly. Even attention span for video is dropped. One thing that I've noticed a lot lately is, there are a lot of walkthrough videos from developers, like especially indies, because they do want to get, more coverage out there on YouTube so that people can find more information, and that's fine. But you also need to have that one trailer that can really bring people in and get every point across in a very short amount of time. And then later on, you can go and create these sort of walkthroughs where you're a little more conversational in walking through a game and showing off all the features. But even then, you need to be very focused about what you're showing. So if you do have the 10-minute walkthrough, you need to have it planned out very well before you do it so that you can hit every single one of these on one of these points. And I'll bring this back in when we're talking about how to talk to editors, because it basically is the same thing. You've got a limited amount of time to make your point, and you need to do it efficiently because you don't want to waste anybody's time. Press releases. This is an interesting topic because I write a lot of press releases for Unity, but they're not always very effective, especially when it comes to games. They're a very good business tool, and it's a good way to get the word out about your product, like to a very wide market, especially if you're distributing it over the wire, because it's going to end up in a lot of places. But it's not quite as an effective tool for video games anymore. I know that when I was at IGN, I got a lot of press releases in about games, and I guess it put the name of the game in my head, but I just generally didn't care. I like to be reached out to on a personal level, like from developers. But in that sense, if you are going to write a press release, you need to also use these same rules of conveying your ideas and following your plan, your PR plan, and putting those 3 to 5 points that you're really very serious about and that you want to get across. And always remember to do like everything you do when writing an article, those things you learned in grade school: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Make sure your grammar is good. I actually saw a lot of press releases when I was at IGN where the grammar was very bad, and spelling mistakes and punctuation mistakes. Make sure you read that over, send it to friends, get it proofread. And always, when you're sending out a press kit, include that press release. Make sure to include your press kit with it, because that is the most important thing. Your press release, you know, a lot of people see them as hyperbolic, and you know, generally you have to back those press releases up with some kind of actual asset to show that what you're talking about makes sense.
Yeah, and just building on that, I obviously agree with everything you said. I mean, making sure that the press release is very clear in its message, you know, and remembering that you don't always have to put everything into the press release. It's a starting point. It's an announcement. It's a point by which you're trying to get interest from media, and them asking you questions about the product that you're putting out there. A lot of times you see 2-page press releases that are, you know, have immense detail about what a game includes, and that's not really the place to go into that sort of detail. You know, I think, you know, for a lot of games, what I've seen work very well in lieu of a press release is combining, you know, a tweet that says, hey, we're announcing, you know, XYZ game, come follow this link to check out our full kind of, you know, announcement at our blog. And it's much more informal, and it's much more effective because, you know, when you're trying to reach those early adopters, those hardcore gamers, you know, and you can say, you know, hey, check out our blog. You can get a ton of detail on our game. You can see screenshots. If you want even more detail than what we have in our blog post, go to the game page. It's right here. And you're starting, and that sort of begins a pattern of engagement with that gamer, right? Because now you've not only you not only have them on Twitter, but they've now gone to your site. They're now looking at screenshots. The chance that they're going to be interested in your game has dramatically risen, and the likelihood that they're going to come back to learn more when you have another thing to share is pretty high compared to just throwing out a press release to a media contact list, half of which you probably have never met. More than half is probably not going to write anything about the press release. So I think the key thing when you think about a press release, if you're writing it, it's got to be something big. It's got to be a big announcement. My company's starting. We've sold 1 million units, something like that. If you're announcing, if it's your first game and you're starting an indie studio and nobody knows who you are, press release probably isn't going to be very effective.
Yeah. So, whoa, this one's a little out of order. One of the most important parts of your campaign is going to be the review cycle. You know, all this leading up, especially when it comes to iOS, because that's really the biggest push you have to make in order to get people to review your game. You want to do your research. You want to know who your targets are in the media. You want to make sure who the biggest outlets are that you need to hit. Like if you're an iOS or an Android game, you need to be on Pocket Gamer and Touch Arcade. If you're a console game, you need to probably hit up IGN and GameSpot and pray that they pay attention, frankly. So it's really just doing simple research. A lot of what PR is groundwork, like, you know, being on the ground and really just sending a lot of emails. You're going to get rejected a lot. That's just how it's going to work these days because there are so many games. It's establishing relationships. Sorry, just a sec. And just making sure to keep in contact with these guys, but don't spam them. You know, that's not going to be helpful to anybody. They're going to start not liking you, basically.
You know, oftentimes, you know, when I was at Pocket Gamer, I would often get an email and they'd say, "Oh, would you like to review our game?" And you know, there would be no information, there wouldn't be screenshots, there wouldn't be a code to download. Do that ahead of time. Send out a code, assuming that, you know, that person's going to download it. Make it so easy in that initial message to download. Here's all the screenshots. Here's a walkthrough video. Go ahead and download. Here's the code. It's free. Or here's a build. Here's an APK. Something. So that way, all that reviewer has to do is, oh, there's an APK there. The game looks okay. I'll give it a whirl anyway. I'll just dump it on my iPhone or on my Android device. There's a success story right there because you took the moment to be proactive to put the APK in the email or to put the download code. I'll tell you, there were times where, you know, there were games that I would see and I'd be like, I'm probably not going to cover it, you know, but if a code comes through, I'd be like, oh, I'll give it a whirl. You play it, all of a sudden, oh, actually, this is not that bad. Maybe I don't want to review it because it's not going to get a good score. No, you know, these guys were nice, so I'll just do a little news item. You know, so I think it's very, you know, taking that extra little step to sort of be proactive rather than say, do you want to cover my game? No, make them cover your game. Make them excited about your game by putting it in their face, but at the same time, once you do that, sort of step back. And let them kind of work on their own, own time. It's impossible to know what's going on in the mind of an editor. They have a million different games being pitched. They have a million different features that they're being, tasked and assigned to write. So being able to sort of put all those materials in front of them, let them get to it, and let them discover the game on their own terms with everything in front of them it always worked with me.
It is okay to remember, though, that you can follow up with them. I'd say maybe once. Really, and give them a few days. Don't just like pepper them with, hey, did you get my game? Hey, did you get my game? Hey, did you get my game? That is going to guarantee that they're not going to cover your game. Pitching for features, it's a little different, and frankly, when it comes to features, it's going to probably be a lot easier to do if you are a long-term game, PC or console, because you have a lot more to talk about and a lot longer to do it. So you can kind of plan these features out. Here's the weapons, here's the characters, here's more about the story, that kind of stuff. So with these things, again, you're hitting on, like in these features that you're pitching, you're hitting on these main points that you think are important about your game, and you're trying to expound on those so that people do understand why these features are important and why they're so cool. And also for the features, you do want to, again, do research on the people that you're pitching. If you're reaching out to specific guys, you want to know what they're interested in, and if reaching out to them with this feature is even going to pique their interest in what you're talking about. And also, of course, you look at what's trending and what's important, and if your game does, if you see a journalist that tends to write a lot about a certain thing, then hey, you want to pitch them on something that actually is very related in your game.
That makes me think of a conversation I had with a colleague of mine at a website called Co-Optimus, and they specialize in covering co-op games, which is great, and so they only want to cover games that have cooperative multiplayer. Makes sense, right? And what I was really kind of surprised to learn was the number of game submissions and news stories that were being sent their way were not co-op. They were single-player games, or they were MMOs that had multiplayer components that were not cooperative. And the stories that my colleague would say, it's like massive frustration from these developers because they weren't getting covered on a site that doesn't cover their product. And I think having a little bit of awareness of the audience to which you are speaking can go a long way in cultivating excitement and energy, and also, quite frankly, saving time, because it's ultimately wasting your time, and that's your precious resource. It's more precious than the money, because the stuff that we're talking about here is, as Dan said, it's your blood, sweat, and tears that is going to get you coverage in Pocket Gamer and have a massive 50-page thread going on the Touch Arcade forums, right? So being mindful about how you're using that very precious resource of time and not wasting it on things that aren't going to be fruitful, like taking your Myst 5 sequel to Co-Optimus and then kind of crying over the fact that they're not going to cover it.
Social media. So social media is basically PR. I know a lot of people, or there's some people that find them to be different, but they're the same thing. You're doing public outreach with social media. So when you are doing this, it's the same kind of rules. You don't want to spam people. You want people to be your followers and you want to give them information, but putting up like a screenshot all the time and new stuff constantly is going to annoy people. But a lot of this just sort of goes back to what Darren was talking about, and building that core and building your followers so that you can have them go out and spread the word for you. Social media is incredibly important for games at this point. You need to have a Facebook page. You need to have a Twitter account. It has to happen. And you need to do that groundwork to get out there and find your followers and find those dudes that can bring in more followers for you.
One thing, with the rise of social media, particularly Facebook and Twitter, have enabled, great channels in which you can not only put your, message out there, but you can actually communicate with your gamers and potential gamers in a way that you can't on a lot of other channels. I've seen a lot of examples within the last year or two where developers have on their websites not put forums up because it's much more difficult to get people to engage and to bring users into a forum than it is for somebody to add you on Twitter. Particularly because Twitter is much more powerful as a social engagement tool because I can directly answer someone's tweet. So if somebody's asking a question about my game in a forum, maybe that, I have to go into the forum, I have to find the thread, and I have to respond to it in the thread. If I'm on Twitter, I'm already there, and I can follow up with those questions and directly pinpoint that user, and everybody else can see that, regardless of whether or not they're actually directly going to the original message, right? Because it's going to show up in my feed. It's going to show up in the game's feed, so everybody in the community sees that, whereas in a forum, you're only directly answering that one person, and the only people that see it are the people that go into that thread. So I think it's very key, if you're running an MMO, maybe forums make a lot of sense because you have an active community that is willing to go to a dedicated, forum. But if you're doing an iOS puzzle game, or if you're doing a really stylish action game, then maybe forums aren't the way to go. You have to think about the type of gamer that you're engaging. I'm sure that Call of Duty gamers probably spend a lot of time on Facebook and Twitter more so than they would be willing to go into a dedicated forum somewhere. One of the things that they were that was very successful about the way Activision has built that franchise out is they were able to do this sort of companion Call of Duty Elite. They were able to transfer that community into a special place. That's very rare. As an indie developer, that's going to be very difficult for you to do. So using existing channels that people are familiar and comfortable with, rather than trying to sort of compartmentalize your community as separate, is going to be much more effective.
And the one thing to remember too is that when you do have these channels, you need to make sure to pay attention to them. Don't just let them sit there. Make sure to respond when people do ask questions. Or else you're just sort of wasting your opportunities. One other tiny thing to think about is that this is, social media is free, basically. You can pay on Facebook to get more people to see what you're posting. I don't think if you're building it correctly, I don't think you really need to, but you can if it comes to that. But remember, this is free, so that's always nice. And kind of last, do you need help? Sometimes it is really hard to do PR properly when you don't have the time or the resources. PR is expensive when it comes to actually paying a service to help you out. It's not cheap. There are guys that do it for indies that they do lower rates because they know that you guys can't afford it. But it is expensive, and that's something to think about for sure when you're putting your plan together. Am I going to need somebody to help me do this outreach because there's so much of it? Because I need to be developing the game. Do you want to hire somebody internally? These are questions you do have to ask yourself, and only you guys can answer those, frankly, because it's all about whatever your game is whatever you're trying to do to get your game out there. So, once you've laid your plan and kind of looked through all of this stuff and figured out what you're going to do, it's all about pitching. And there's certain rules, and I'm going to have to run through these pretty fast because we're running out of time. But this, it goes back to some of the same stuff we were already talking about. Be clear and concise. What are the goals of your game? What are the focus? The 3 to 5 focuses. Don't go over 3 to 5. You need to have those things be your main things. Don't have that bullet point list Darren was talking about. That's not useful. Having the list of your game's got 15 weapons, who cares? Frankly, let's be honest. What makes it special and what audience are you aiming to capture? You need to know all of these things in order to pitch properly to editors. Those awesome assets. So unless you are a well-known developer, and there probably are some of you, journalists will not take you at your word when it comes to what you're saying about your game. They're just not going to. They see too many. And they see a lot there where people are like, hey, my game's awesome, you should check it out, and the game's not awesome. It's just not. Yeah, sorry. It's just the truth. You need to back up your talk with the eye candy. The screenshots in the video, like we talked before, these need to be concise and tell your story. It's just, that's kind of redundant, but you make sure your assets are incredible. You really do only have one chance to make that first impression. If you give them crappy assets to begin with, they're just going to sort of disregard the rest of your emails from now on. And they're not going to look for more information about your game because they're like, they have a lot of other stuff to look at. Don't ramble. If you get on the phone with somebody at one of these organizations, with a journalist, you're actually lucky enough to get somebody on the phone, get to the point. Don't keep them on the phone for a long time. You've got maybe 2 minutes to sell them on a game in this initial pitch. You got to explain it quickly. You got to hit those points, those 3 to 5 points. Again, I'm just going to keep nailing that in. And tell them that you're going to follow them up with an email, and then you can send more information. But you've made that contact. You've gotten on the phone, and that's a great step, frankly, because having that voice contact with somebody is a big deal. And then when you say you're going to follow up, actually follow up. I've had that several times where people called me and said, yep, I'll follow up with an email, and I never got the email. It's crazy, right? It just seems like normal, but that's actually what happens sometimes. And balancing efficiency with conversation, it's a tricky thing, because you don't want to just throw it out there like some crazy car salesman pitch for this. You do want to be sort of casual and calm when you are pitching this. So it's a lot about practicing before you call. I know that sounds weird because it's just a phone call, but it's also very true. Yeah.
I think the best approach, at least the one that I think back at times where a developer is putting a new game in front of me, and usually a nonchalant approach works. We're doing a really incredible RPG with a loot system that you've never seen before. Check it out. I don't need to tell you anything because you're going to play it and you're going to see. The proof is in playing. You don't want to be screaming, "Epic mind melt, get some now!" Like, you have to play this game, because that's what we hear. Journalists hear every day, and that's not unique. That's not special. Everybody wants to be epic, of course. But that, yeah, that's it.
All right, when you're giving a demo, a lot of the same rules apply. Don't wing it. Like, if you actually do get an appointment with press and you have a little bit of time with them, prepare. Please prepare. I can't tell you how many times somebody came in with the demo and just sort of like, hey, here's my game, and they loaded up a level and they're like, let me see if I can find this thing. No. You got to reference your PR plan and your key messaging. Say, these are the points that I need to hit in this demo, and make a demo. Like, even if you have to build a level for this, you do that, because that's very important. Otherwise, you're wasting these guys' time. I can't tell you how many times people came in and gave me some crappy demo that lasted 45 minutes, and I was just sitting there looking at my watch the entire time, tapping my foot, wondering when it was going to be over, and then never wanting to talk to them again, because I didn't want that to happen. Because these guys are crazy busy. I know they're just being bombarded at this point. Like, even when I was at IGN, it was overwhelming. And now it's just even crazier, because there are so many indie games, and there's so many iOS games and so many Android games. It's completely overwhelming to these guys. And they can't cover everything, so you need to make sure to be very efficient in how you present your stuff, and everything is built to show off what you want to show off. Make sure your demo can end within 5 to 10 minutes, and 5 is probably better than 10. 10 is reaching an upper level. You need to be able to show off everything you want in those 5 minutes, and I know that can be hard, but you need to work at it and make sure that level is prepared for this. You really don't have much more time than that before somebody starts getting annoyed. The good news is, if people are asking questions, they like your game, and your demo can stretch a little bit longer, and you can pause in the middle of giving a demo and expand on some features you were talking about. But make sure that when you have it planned, it's for that 5-minute mark, so that you can get through everything you need in that short amount of time. Yeah, I remember one particular instance where somebody brought in an MMO, and they wanted to show me some stuff, but they had to run to where they wanted to show the stuff. And this guy literally ran for about 15 minutes before he got to where he wanted to show the thing. He didn't even have a teleport code to get there. That's a really bad idea. Just so you know, don't do that kind of stuff. This is sort of the same thing. Don't waste their time. Make sure your game is working properly. Test that demo before you bring it in. Make sure you make sure that stuff you want to show is quickly accessible, all in the same area. You don't have to show every area in the game. Show something that's very impressive, like your favorite area, and find the points that you want to touch on. And you need to get, in the first 2 minutes of this demo, there has to be something to pique their interest, to draw them in farther, and to get them asking questions. That needs to happen very quickly, or their mind is going to start wandering, even in that 2 minutes. I know that sounds crazy, but it's just the case. And don't go off on tangents. That happened an awful lot where somebody started talking about something and they're like, oh, and there's this other cool thing. And then just started rambling. Sorry, now I am rambling. Okay. And this is the last slide, and one of the most important, actually. And I know that like a lot of indies especially do want to say whatever they want about a game, and that's great. But just remember, nothing is off the record. You're talking to a journalist, they will write about it if they think it's interesting. If you're in a bar getting drinks and you talk to them and they think it's interesting, they will write about it. A lot of them won't because they're nice and they do actually stand by their word of off the record, but don't assume that that's what's going to happen because there are guys that are just looking to get information out of you. So if you do want to keep something tight, you don't have to. Obviously, it's up to you guys how you do this stuff, but if you want to keep something back for later, don't start talking about it. That's just it. And journalists, as friendly as they can be, aren't really your friends when it comes down to it. It says here they're your frenemies. They can be friendly, and they're great. A lot of them are great people, but you need to be careful because, they are reviewing your games. They're writing about you. They're journalists. There's only while you can be friends with them, it's also a very difficult balance because you need to be careful about that. And that's it. So I guess we're pretty close on time, but if anybody has any questions, we can field some of those. Please walk up to the microphone, and afterwards, if there are more questions, we'll be out in the lobby since we'll need to clear out of here, and we'll be happy to answer anything.
So I just wanted to challenge or ask a question, get feedback, because everyone is really busy. Everyone has something better to do than be on Twitter or answer Twitter or have a real life, a human life, instead of their avatar life on the internet or even in a game. So, in this period, first question is part of two questions, is, how long, what's the range you think is reasonable for an indie nobody knows about to build their community? Like somebody who has a credibility and a network in the game industry, maybe it's 2 months to build that community, but maybe it's 4 years to build a community. But I have a big challenge here, and shouldn't you be launching your game, testing on that platform, and part of it, allowing it to evolve? It's not like a song or a movie, because you can keep adding things to a game. Can't that be part of the building community period?
Sure.
Especially with so many platforms, because if you only get like 30,000 or 40,000 or 50,000 downloads, the world's a big place.
Yeah, I mean,
there's so many countries, so many devices.
Yeah. For indies especially, building the community is going to be a multi-game process, frankly. So it's... did I misunderstand the question?
I think one of the things you can do, and when I spoke about in the marketing, was trying to avoid the specific do this, do that kind of advice, because it's going to vary so much on the game. It's becoming quite common, so to your point, how can you build a community? Remember, we're talking about the community can be small, and that can even extend down to the point that if you're making an iOS game, you could choose to launch it in just one market. So you could decide, right, I'm going to launch this game in New Zealand only. Try to climb to the top of a subgenre in the New Zealand App Store. That builds a community. You can iterate. You can get data back. So that way you're getting the development benefit. So you're seeing live users and getting live feedback. You're also building the community, because then you can start moving to selective iOS stores that possibly are just the English-speaking ones. So the classic approach is to go New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Scandinavia. Then you start tackling the UK and US. That's becoming a standard approach. So that's a very specific example, but it's going to be tied very, very tightly to the type of game you're making in the platform.
Right, okay. And do you think iOS is still the platform that you want to start with first to build a community? Or do you think, like with, maybe Facebook?
That's pretty game specific.
Game
right?
specific.
Yeah. So it really has to do with the specific product. So, we're happy to follow up, but we only have a minute left.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Sorry, one quick thing before everyone gets out of here. I do have a sample PR plan. If you want to leave your business card with us, I'm happy to send that to you, just so you have like some kind of skeleton to work through. So please do leave your business card, and we'll get that to you if you want. One more questions or one? Okay.
So my question is about video. Obviously, a 45-minute video is too long.
Right.
2 to 5 minutes, 30 seconds. Should you be going for Vine clips? And the sort of second part is resolution. Should you be thinking about how it looks on an iPhone versus a desktop PC and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, that's actually a good point. And you do want to make sure that when it's on YouTube, you want to get it as high a resolution as possible, but you do need to make sure that it looks good on those lower resolutions as well. Yeah, that's a good point. So anybody else who has a question, please meet us out in the lobby right outside, and we'll be happy to answer. And if you do want that PR plan, just come and drop your business cards off with us, and we'll get that to you.
All right,
thank
thank
you.
you so much. We have